The scream of the Heinkel bomber tearing through the cloud cover was the last sound Emily Hartwell expected to hear while holding a soldering iron over a broken wireless set in her father's garden shed. She froze. The iron trembled in her hand, a bead of molten solder dripping onto the workbench like a tear of liquid silver. Outside, the sheep in the meadow scattered in blind panic, their bleating swallowed by the growing roar of German engines. The sound was unmistakable. A mechanical howl that had become the anthem of terror across southern England. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Through the gaps in the shed's wooden walls, she could see the shadow of the aircraft slide across the spring grass like a predator's silhouette. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. This was Suffolk. Quiet, pastoral Suffolk. The war wasn't supposed to reach here, not yet. But it had. 3 months earlier, Emily had been a mathematics lecturer at Cambridge, living in a world of theorems and proofs, where the only battles were fought with chalk on blackboards. She had worn tweed skirts and sensible shoes, carried leather satchels filled with student papers, and believed that her contribution to the war effort would be teaching young men calculus before they shipped off to France. Then the letter arrived. Miss E. Hartwell. Your expertise in electromagnetic theory has been noted. Report to the Air Ministry Research Station, Bawdsey Manor, Suffolk. Immediate deployment. Classified work of national importance. She'd read it 3 times, sitting in her college rooms, while rain drummed against the window. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting shadows that seemed to reach for her like dark fingers. National importance. Classified. Her father had been a wireless operator in the Great War, had come home with shaking hands and eyes that stared at things no one else could see. He'd built his shed in the garden as a sanctuary, filling it with vacuum tubes and copper wire, crystal sets and oscilloscopes, a temple to the invisible world of radio waves. Emily had learned electronics at his knee, had fallen asleep as a child to the crackle and hiss of distant transmissions. After he died, his heart giving out one quiet morning while reaching for his morning tea, she'd kept the shed exactly as he'd left it, a shrine, a memorial. A place where she could still feel his presence in the smell of rosin flux and aged paper insulation. Now that she was about to become something else entirely. The morning she arrived at Bawdsey Manor, fog rolled in from the North Sea like a living thing, thick and cold and tasting of salt. The manor itself loomed through the mist, a Victorian Gothic pile of red brick and pointed towers that looked more like a setting for a ghost story than a military installation. A young RAF officer met her at the gate. Flight Lieutenant James Crawford. He couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair and eyes that held the kind of exhaustion that comes from too many sleepless nights. His uniform was crisp, but there was something disheveled about him, the faint shadow of stubble, the slight tremor in his hands as he signed her in. Miss Hartwell, welcome to the madhouse. His smile was brief, almost apologetic. They walked through corridors that smelled of damp stone and cigarette smoke. Somewhere deeper in the building, she could hear the rhythmic pulse of generators, the electric hum of equipment running day and night. Men in shirt sleeves hurried past carrying stacks of paper, their faces drawn and pale in the fluorescent lighting. Crawford led her to a room at the top of one of the towers. Inside, a group of men stood around a table covered with technical drawings and photographs. They looked up as she entered, and for a moment, there was that familiar flicker. Surprise, doubt, the unspoken question of what a woman was doing here. Then one of them stepped forward. Professor Robert Watson Watt. She recognized him from academic journals, though he looked older now, his face lined with the weight of responsibility. Miss Hartwell, your work on wave propagation theory, brilliant stuff. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Within minutes, she understood why she'd been summoned. They called it RDF, Radio Direction Finding, a system that could detect aircraft at distances thought impossible just years before, by bouncing radio waves off metal fuselages and measuring the echoes. It was revolutionary, it was desperate, and it was all that stood between England and annihilation. The Luftwaffe has 3,000 aircraft, Watson Watt said, his voice flat and factual. We have perhaps 600 serviceable fighters. The only way we survive is if we know they're coming before they arrive. We need every second of warning we can get. He spread his hands across the map on the table. It showed the eastern coast of England, dotted with red markers. We're building a chain of stations, 20, eventually more, but we don't have time to construct proper facilities, so we're improvising. Crawford pointed to one of the markers. This is your station, Miss Hartwell, near Dunwich. You'll have a team of 3 engineers, 2 operators, and whatever equipment we can scrounge. Your housing is a transmitter tower and... He paused, almost embarrassed. A garden shed. Emily stared at the map. Dunwich. She knew that name. A medieval town that had fallen into the sea centuries ago, claimed by erosion and storms. Only ruins remained, crumbling church walls and scattered graves emerging from the sand at low tide. A ghost town for a ghost war. How soon? She asked. You leave tomorrow. The shed sat in a field 2 miles inland from the cliffs, surrounded by gorse bushes and wild roses that were just beginning to bloom. Someone had tried to camouflage it with netting and branches, but it still looked exactly like what it was. A farmer's storage building pressed into desperate service. Inside, it was chaos. Cables snaked across the floor like mechanical vines. Racks of equipment lined the walls, receivers and amplifiers cobbled together from parts scavenged from a dozen different sources. Some of it was cutting-edge prototype technology. Some of it looked like it belonged in a museum. Her team consisted of 2 Cambridge engineering students, boys, really, barely 20 years old, and a Royal Navy petty officer named McKinnon, who'd worked on ship radar and had the blessed ability to make anything function with enough wire and profanity. The transmitter tower stood 50 yards away, a skeletal steel structure rising like a gallows against the Suffolk sky. At its top, the antenna arrays caught the light, metal crossbars that would send invisible fingers of radio energy out into the darkness, searching for the enemy. Emily spent the first week learning the equipment, understanding its quirks and failures. The receivers were temperamental. The cathode ray tube display, which showed incoming aircraft as glowing blips of light, had a tendency to flicker and fade. They worked 18-hour days, sleeping in shifts on camp beds, living on tea and sandwiches brought by a local woman who never asked questions. At night, Emily would stand outside the shed and listen to the sea. Sometimes she could hear the bells of Dunwich's drowned churches, or so the locals claimed. Phantom bells ringing beneath the waves, calling the faithful to services that would never come. She understood the metaphor. They were all ghosts now, haunting the edge of an empire that was slowly drowning. The first real contact came on a morning when the sky was the color of old bruises. Emily was at the console, adjusting the gain on the receiver, when the display suddenly flared with light. Multiple contacts, distance, 40 miles, bearing, east. Coming in fast, her hand shot to the telephone. Bawdsey, this is Station Echo. Multiple hostiles, bearing 090, range 40 miles. Estimate 20 plus aircraft. Crawford's voice crackled back, tight with urgency. Echo, confirm count and heading. Confirmed. They're heading straight for the coast. She could hear shouting in the background, the scramble order being given. Somewhere, fighter pilots were running to their Hurricanes and Spitfires, engines coughing to life, propellers beginning to spin. And it was all because of what she'd seen on a flickering screen in a garden shed. The bombers came in low over the water, trying to avoid detection, but the radar saw them anyway, painting their positions with invisible light. The RAF fighters intercepted them 10 miles out to sea. Emily and her team listened to the battle on the wireless. Terse commands, the rattle of machine guns, the sudden silence when someone went down. When it was over, 5 German bombers had been destroyed. 2 British fighters had been lost. Without the warning, the bombers would have reached their targets unopposed. Towns would have burned. People would have died. Emily sat in the shed afterward, hands shaking, unable to stop seeing those glowing blips on the screen. Each one had represented men, German boys not much older than her engineering students, flying toward their deaths because someone had ordered them to. She'd helped kill them. McKinnon found her there an hour later, staring at nothing. You did your job, he said quietly. You saved lives. British lives. I know. But knowledge didn't make it easier. Now, 3 months into her deployment, The Heinkel bomber roared overhead, and Emily dropped the soldering iron. She burst out of the shed, looking up. The aircraft was already past, climbing back into the clouds, but she'd seen enough. The black crosses on its wings. The glass nose where the bombardier would be lying, searching for targets. It was alone. A reconnaissance flight, probably. Photographing installations, mapping defenses, looking for garden sheds that shouldn't be there. Her radio operator, a young corporal named Davies, came running from the transmitter tower. "Miss Hartwell, should we report it?" Emily's mind raced. If they reported it, they'd confirm that there was something here worth protecting. If they didn't, the Luftwaffe might dismiss the shed as unimportant. But they'd been seen. There was no denying that. Yes. "Report it, and tell Bawdsey we may need to relocate." Davies nodded and sprinted back to the tower. Emily stood in the meadow, watching the sky where the bomber had disappeared. The sheep had calmed down, were already returning to their grazing as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. They'd been invisible. Now they were visible. And being visible in wartime meant being a target. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay on her camp bed, listening to the wind rattle the shed's tin roof, and thought about her father. He'd believed in the power of radio, believed it could connect people across impossible distances, could bring voices out of the void, could make the invisible visible. He'd been right. But he'd never imagined it being used like this. She got up, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and walked outside. The moon was nearly full, painting the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. From here, she could see the transmitter tower silhouetted against the stars, its antenna arrays reaching upward like supplicant hands. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, German bombers were preparing for the next raid. And somewhere closer, British fighters were waiting, their pilots sleeping fitfully in dispersal huts, ready to scramble at a moment's notice. The whole war had become a game of invisible chess, played with radio waves and radar echoes, where seeing the enemy first meant the difference between survival and extinction. And she, Emily Hartwell, mathematics lecturer, daughter of a shell-shocked wireless operator, was somehow a player in that game. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something else. A strange, fierce pride. Not in the killing, but in the knowing. In the understanding that her father's shed, filled with his dreams of connection, had become a watchtower in the darkness. She would defend it. Defend the invisible light it cast. Defend the lives it saved. Even if it meant becoming a ghost herself, haunting this cold shore until the war's end or her own. A shooting star scratched across the sky, brief and bright. Emily made a wish, though she didn't believe in wishes anymore. She wished for morning, and for the strength to see it. The attack came at dawn, when the world was caught between darkness and light, and the horizon bled purple and gold like a fresh bruise. Emily was checking the cathode ray tube display when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the Suffolk morning. Not the rumble of distant engines or the cry of seabirds wheeling over the cliffs. This was closer. Sharper. The whistle of something falling through air at terminal velocity. "Down!" McKinnon's roar came from outside the shed, and Emily's body reacted before her mind could process the command. She threw herself under the equipment rack as the world exploded. The bomb struck 50 yards away, in the meadow between the shed and the transmitter tower. The blast wave hit like a physical fist, slamming the shed's walls inward. Glass shattered. Equipment flew from its mountings. The air itself seemed to scream, a banshee wail of overpressure and fragmenting metal. Emily's ears rang with a high, pure note that drowned out everything else. She tasted blood and dirt, couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only curl tighter as debris rained down on the tin roof like apocalyptic hail. Then silence, the terrible ringing silence that comes after violence. She crawled out from under the rack, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the equipment. The shed's door hung from one hinge. Through the gap, she could see smoke rising from a crater in the meadow, a raw wound in the earth still glowing at its edges. "Davies!" she screamed, but her voice sounded distant, muffled by the ringing in her ears. "McKinnon!" Movement outside. McKinnon emerged from behind a pile of sandbags they'd stacked near the tower base, his face blackened with soot, blood running from a cut above his eye. He was dragging something. Someone. Davies. Emily stumbled out of the shed, her legs weak as water. The corporal was unconscious, a piece of shrapnel buried in his shoulder. His uniform was soaked red. He was at the tower, McKinnon gasped. Blast through him 20 feet. Christ, Emily, they knew. They bloody knew exactly where we were. She looked up at the sky, her training overriding her terror. No aircraft visible. They'd come in fast and low, dropped their bomb, and vanished back into the morning clouds. Precision strike. Not random. Not exploratory. The reconnaissance flight 3 days ago. That damned Heinkel had photographed them, mapped their position, marked them for destruction. Get him inside, Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. We need to stop the bleeding. They carried Davies into the shed. Emily's hands moved on autopilot, tearing open his uniform, packing the wound with field dressings from their medical kit. The shrapnel was deep, buried in muscle. She could feel it grating against bone. Davies' eyes fluttered open. The tower, he whispered. Is it? Standing, McKinnon said. They missed it. Barely. But they wouldn't miss next time. Emily knew that with the cold certainty that comes from understanding your enemy. The Luftwaffe had sent a message. We see you. We can reach you. We can kill you. The telephone rang. A sound so absurdly normal it took Emily a moment to process it. She grabbed the receiver with blood-slick hands. Echo Station, this is Bawdsey. We monitored the attack. What's your status? Crawford, his voice tight with controlled fear. 1 casualty, Davies. Shrapnel wound. We need medical evacuation immediately. Ambulance is already en route. Emily... He paused, and she could hear him breathing, could imagine him standing in some office at the manor, staring at a map with her position marked in red. We're pulling you out. All coastal stations are being relocated. The Germans know where you are now. When? Tonight, after dark. Can you maintain operations until then? She looked around the shed. Half the equipment was destroyed or damaged. The main receiver had torn free from its mounting and lay on its side, vacuum tubes shattered, wiring exposed like mechanical entrails. But the backup systems were intact. The transmitter tower still stood. Yes, we can maintain. Good, because they're coming again. Big raid, targeting the coastal towns. You're our only eyes in that sector now. The weight of those words settled on her shoulders like physical mass. Lives depending on a broken shed and exhausted people. We'll be here, she said, and hung up before he could hear the tremor in her voice. The ambulance came an hour later. A converted grocer's van with a red cross painted hastily on its side. They loaded Davies on a stretcher, his face gray with blood loss, his breathing shallow. He tried to speak, but Emily shushed him. You did brilliantly, she said, squeezing his hand. Rest now. After the ambulance left, she and McKinnon worked in frantic silence to repair what they could. The main receiver was beyond salvation, but the backup unit could be coaxed back to life with new tubes and careful soldering. The display flickered and wavered, but it would work. It had to work. Around noon, the 2 Cambridge students returned from town where they'd been collecting supplies. They stopped at the edge of the crater, staring. Bloody hell, the younger one, Thompson, whispered. Emily didn't have time for shock. Get over here, we need you. They worked through the afternoon, barely speaking, moving with the desperate efficiency of people who know the clock is ticking. Outside, the sun tracked across the sky, beautiful and indifferent. Sheep grazed in the meadow, carefully avoiding the smoking crater. At 4 o'clock, the equipment came back online. The cathode ray tube glowed green in the shed's dim interior, its swept trace painting circles of light like the world's loneliest lighthouse. Emily watched it, hypnotized. Each sweep was a question cast into the void. Are you there? Are you coming? At 5:30, the void answered. Contacts. Multiple. Distance, 60 miles and closing. Her hand was steady on the telephone now. Bawdsey, this is Echo. Multiple hostiles, bearing 085, range 60 miles. Estimate 30 plus aircraft, large formation. Confirmed, Echo. Fighters are scrambling. Stay on the line. She stayed. Watched the blips creep closer on the display. 30 miles, 25. She could track them almost in real time now, could see the formation splitting. Some heading for the coast, others turning inland. Behind her, McKinnon had the wireless receiver tuned to the fighter frequency. They could hear it all, the terse commands, the call-outs of enemy positions, the crackle of gunfire. Blue leader, bandits at 3 o'clock high. I see them, breaking left. Watch it, Johnny. There's 2 more on your 6. The voices were young. So impossibly young. Boys playing a deadly game in machines that could turn them into burning meteors in an instant. On Emily's display, one of the blips intersected with the fighter positions. Merged. Vanished. Someone had just died. British or German, she didn't know. Just gone. A dot of light extinguished. She tasted bile. The battle raged for 30 minutes. The German formation broke apart, scattered by the fighters. Some turned back toward France. Others pressed on, desperate to reach their targets. 3 bombers made it through. Emily tracked them all the way to the coast, watched them pass overhead, so close she could hear the engines even through the shed's walls. The anti-aircraft guns at Ipswich opened up, black flowers of flak blooming in the evening sky. 1 bomber fell, trailing smoke and fire. The other 2 released their payloads and fled. Later, Emily would learn that 18 people died in that raid. A tenement building collapsed in Ipswich. A bus caught in the street, full of workers heading home. 18 people. But without the warning, it would have been hundreds. That was the mathematics of war. The cold calculus of saved and lost. Night fell. Emily stood outside the shed, watching the stars emerge. Behind her, McKinnon and the students were packing equipment into crates, preparing for the evacuation that would come with darkness. Crawford arrived just after midnight, driving a lorry with blackout curtains over its windows. He looked exhausted, his eyes hollow. "Ready?" he asked. Emily turned to look at the shed, her father's shed. It had survived 1 attack, but it wouldn't survive another. Soon, German bombers would return and reduce it to splinters. All those hours her father had spent here, building his sanctuary. All his dreams of connecting people, of using radio to bring voices across the void. Now it would become just another casualty, another ghost. "Yes," she said. "We're ready." They loaded the equipment in silence. The transmitter tower would stay, too large to move quickly, and too obvious a target to matter anymore. But everything else went into the lorry: receivers, displays, the backup generator, boxes of vacuum tubes and spare parts. As they worked, Emily noticed something odd. Crawford kept glancing at her, as if working up the courage to speak. Finally, as they secured the last crate, "Emily, there's something you should know." She waited. "The station they're moving you to. It's not like this. It's different." Different how? He chose his words carefully. "You'll be working directly with Fighter Command, coordinating the entire air defense network for the southeastern sector. It's a promotion. More responsibility. More pressure," she finished. "Yes." She understood. They were moving her closer to the center. Closer to the decisions that meant life or death for thousands. The garden shed had been the beginning. Now came something larger. Something more dangerous. "And there's one more thing," Crawford said, his voice dropping. "We lost 3 radar operators last week. 2 killed in bombing raids. 1 had a breakdown, couldn't handle the strain. We're running out of people who can do this work. People who can see death coming and not fall apart." Emily looked at him. Really looked. Saw the weight he carried. The knowledge of all the people who died on his watch. All the decisions that had gone wrong despite everyone's best efforts. "You want to know if I can handle it," she said quietly. "I need to know." Could she? Emily thought of Davies, bleeding in the dirt. Thought of those 18 people in Ipswich who would never go home. Thought of the German boys falling in flames over the North Sea. Thought of her father, who'd come back from one war broken and haunted. "I can handle it," she said. "Until I can't." It was the only honest answer. Crawford nodded slowly. "That'll have to be enough." They drove away as dawn began to break. Emily watched through the lorry's rear window as the shed and its skeletal tower receded into the distance. In the growing light, they looked almost peaceful. Just another piece of rural England, quietly sleeping. But she knew better. She'd learned to see the invisible war that raged all around them, fought with radio waves and radar echoes. Had learned that seeing comes with a price. The question was, how much more she'd have to pay before it was over. If it was ever over. The lorry turned a corner, and the shed disappeared behind a line of trees. Emily closed her eyes and tried not to think about what came next. But the war wouldn't let her stop thinking. It never did. Ahead, the sky was turning gold with morning light. Behind them, the ghosts were gathering. The new station wasn't a garden shed. It was a concrete bunker sunk 15 feet into the chalk hills of Kent, reinforced with steel beams and sandbags, connected by underground cables to a network that stretched along the entire southern coast. No windows, no natural light. Just the perpetual hum of generators and the ghostly green glow of radar displays that never slept. Emily descended the metal stairs into what felt like a tomb, carrying her few possessions in a canvas bag. The air inside was thick and processed, filtered through ventilation systems that couldn't quite remove the smell of unwashed bodies and cigarette smoke. 30 people worked here in rotating shifts, living underground like coal miners, emerging only when their duty ended to stumble into daylight that hurt their eyes. This was Bentley Priory's forward coordination station, the nerve center. The place where invisible dots on screens became life-or-death decisions for fighter squadrons across 3 counties. A WAF officer met her at the bottom of the stairs. Section Officer Margaret Winters, stern-faced and efficient, with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that had seen too many young people break under pressure. "Miss Hartwell, your reputation precedes you. Garden shed in Suffolk, I understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "No more sheds here, just results." Winters gestured down a narrow corridor lined with cables. "You'll be lead controller for Sector 7. That's Dover to Dungeness, the front door to England. When the Germans come, they come through your sector first. Your decisions will determine whether our fighters intercept in time or whether London burns." The weight of those words settled on Emily like a physical thing. No pressure then. Winters led her to the operations room, a vast underground chamber dominated by a massive plotting table, its surface marked with grid coordinates and position markers. Around the table's edges stood plotters, mostly women, holding long rakes with markers on the end, ready to move symbols representing friend and foe across the map as reports came in. Above them, in a gallery, controllers sat at stations with telephones and headsets, communicating with fighter squadrons, anti-aircraft batteries, and the chain of radar stations along the coast. It looked like something from a science fiction story. But it was real, and it was all that stood between England and invasion. "Your station." Winters pointed to a position in the gallery. "You'll coordinate data from 6 radar stations, correlate it with visual reports from the Observer Corps, and direct fighter intercepts. You'll have 2 minutes, sometimes less, to assess a situation and make the call. Wrong decision, our fighters are out of position. Right decision, we stop them." "And if I'm not sure?" Emily asked. Winters' expression didn't change. "Then you make your best guess and live with the consequences. There's no time for certainty in this war." The first week was a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. Emily worked 12-hour shifts in the gallery, headset clamped to her ears, watching the plotting table below as raids developed and dissolved like storms forming over water. The radar stations fed her information in constant streams: bearing, range, altitude, estimated numbers. She learned to read the patterns, to distinguish between bomber formations and fighter escorts, to predict which raids were feints and which were genuine threats. She learned the voices of the fighter pilots, too. Could recognize Blue Leader's clipped public school accent, Red 3's nervous stammer, Yellow 5's dark humor even in combat. They became real to her in a way the dots on the display never had. And then they died, and new voices replaced them. And she learned those too. The other controllers were a mixed group. Some were RAF officers, career military men who'd been doing this since before the war. Others were civilians like her, mathematicians and engineers pulled from universities and research labs. They worked side by side, united by exhaustion and the knowledge that mistakes had body counts. McKinnon was there too, transferred with her, though he worked in the technical section maintaining the equipment. Sometimes she'd see him in the corridor during shift changes, and they'd exchange tired nods. No words needed. They'd both seen too much to need words. 3 weeks into her deployment, the big raid came. It started as a ripple on the radar screens. Contacts appearing at the edge of detection range, 50 miles out, then 40. The numbers kept climbing. 20 aircraft, 30, 50. More contacts appearing behind the first wave. Emily's hand was steady on the telephone. All sectors, this is Control. Major raid developing. Estimate 100 plus hostiles inbound. All available fighters scramble immediately. Below her, the plotting table erupted into controlled chaos. Markers appeared, moved, multiplied. The plotters worked with machine precision, translating radio reports into physical reality on the map. Sector 7, enemy formation splitting. 40 aircraft bearing for Dover, remainder turning north toward the Thames estuary. Emily's mind raced, calculating intercept angles, fuel states, flight times. 11 squadrons were airborne or scrambling. Not enough. Never enough. She had to prioritize, had to decide which targets got intercepted and which got through. Vector Blue Squadron to Dover formation. Angels 2-0. Red Squadron, climb to patrol Dover at Angels 2-5. Yellow and Green Squadrons, hold position Thames estuary. The acknowledgements came back, clipped and professional. Then the waiting. The terrible waiting while friendly and hostile markers crawled across the map toward collision. In her headset, she could hear the pilots' voices. Blue Leader calling tally-ho as he spotted the enemy. The crackle of machine guns. Someone screaming that they were hit. On the plotting table, markers merged. Separated. Some disappeared entirely. The raid lasted 90 minutes. When it was over, 23 German aircraft had been destroyed or damaged. 14 British fighters had been lost. The bombers that got through hit the docks at Dover, killed 37 people, wounded hundreds more. Emily sat in her station after the raid, hands shaking, unable to move. She'd made the right calls. The battle analysis confirmed it. Without proper interception, losses would have been catastrophic. She'd saved lives. But she'd also sent men to die. Blue Leader, Red 3, Yellow 7. Voices she'd known, now silent forever. Winters appeared beside her. You did well. I sent them into a slaughter. You sent them to do their job. They knew the risks. So do you. Winter's voice softened, just fractionally. The first time is always the hardest. It doesn't get easier, but you learn to carry it. You have to. Because tomorrow there'll be another raid, and you'll have to do it all again. Emily looked up at her. How do you carry it? Badly, but I carry it anyway. Winters paused. Get some rest. Your shift is over. But Emily didn't rest. She went to the technical section, found McKinnon bent over a workbench repairing a display unit, and just stood there until he looked up. Rough day? He asked quietly. Blue Leader bought it. And Red 3. I sent them there. McKinnon set down his soldering iron. You gave them a fighting chance. Without your vectors, they'd have flown blind. It would have been worse. I know, but knowing doesn't help. No, he agreed. It doesn't. They sat in silence for a while, surrounded by the mechanical ghosts of radar equipment, the vacuum tubes and transformers and miles of copper wire that had become instruments of war. Finally, Emily spoke. My father used to say that radio was magic, that it could connect people across impossible distances, let them hear each other's voices through the darkness. Wise man. He also said that any technology can be twisted, that the same waves that carry music can guide bombers. That seeing too much can break you. McKinnon nodded slowly. Was he right? Emily thought about the garden shed in Suffolk, now probably destroyed by German bombs. Thought about Davies, recovering in a hospital with a shrapnel scar he'd carry forever. Thought about all the dots on radar screens that represented human lives about to end. Yes, she said. He was right about all of it. The raids continued, day after day, night after night. The Luftwaffe was relentless, throwing everything they had at the British defenses, trying to break through, trying to clear the skies for invasion. And Emily kept watching, kept tracking, kept making the impossible decisions. She learned to function on 3 hours of sleep, learned to eat standing up, to wash in cold water from buckets, to change shifts with barely a pause, learned which controllers would crack under pressure and which would hold, learned the patterns of German tactics, could predict their feints and real targets. She became very good at her job. Frighteningly good. But the price was mounting. She stopped sleeping well even when she had the chance. Would wake from dreams of burning aircraft, of voices calling for help that never came. Would catch herself staring at nothing, lost in thoughts of death and mathematics. One morning, after a particularly brutal night raid, she found herself in the surface-level rest area, staring out a window at the Kent countryside. It was beautiful, rolling green hills, ancient trees, stone walls that had stood for centuries, peaceful, eternal. Crawford found her there. He'd been promoted now, coordinating multiple stations, but he still checked on his people when he could. "Thinking of quitting?" he asked, only half joking. "Every day," Emily said honestly. "But I won't." "Why not?" She gestured at the window, at the world beyond. "Because if we stop watching, all of this ends. Every village, every town, every person living their life without knowing how close they are to annihilation. We're the ones who see it coming. We're the ones who stand between." "The chain that holds," Crawford said quietly. "What?" "That's what Watson Watt calls the radar network. The chain home system. A chain of stations, each one linked to the next, holding the line together. One weak link and the whole thing fails." Emily understood. They were all links in that chain. Her, Crawford, McKinnon, the plotters, the pilots, the ground crews. Thousands of people working in concert, each one essential, each one irreplaceable. And chains broke under strain. "How many operators have we lost now?" she asked. Crawford's expression darkened. 14 killed in raids, 23 casualties, 31 nervous breakdowns or medical discharges. And we're training replacements as fast as we can, but it's not fast enough. No. Emily turned back to the window. A farmer was working in a distant field, probably plowing or planting. Normal life, continuing despite the war raging overhead. He probably didn't know about radar, didn't understand the invisible net that protected him. That was good. Someone should get to live without knowing. "I'll hold," she said, "as long as I can." "I know you will." Crawford started to leave, then paused. "Emily, thank you. For everything you've done. For not breaking." After he left, Emily stood at the window for a long time, watching the farmer work his field. She thought about garden sheds and mathematics, about her father's hands on a telegraph key, about young men burning in Spitfires over the channel. Thought about the invisible chain that held them all together, link by fragile link. And she wondered how much longer she could remain unbroken. The summer wore on, and the raids intensified. The Luftwaffe was trying one final, desperate push to destroy Fighter Command, before autumn weather made invasion impossible. They came in waves, hundreds of aircraft. The plotting tables were never empty now, never clear. The gallery controllers worked around the clock, their voices hoarse from shouting vectors, their eyes burning from staring at maps and displays. Emily stopped counting the losses, stopped learning new names. It was the only way to survive. Then, one afternoon, the pattern changed. A massive raid developed, over 200 aircraft, the largest yet. But something was wrong. The formation was too spread out, too disorganized. The timing was off. Emily watched the plots develop, her exhausted mind suddenly sharp with suspicion. "Control. This is 7. Something's not right. This raid doesn't follow standard doctrine." Winter's voice came back immediately. "Explain." "The fighter escort is too far ahead of the bombers. They'll run out of fuel before the bombers reach target. And the approach vector is wrong for hitting London or the airfields. They're scattered. A pause. Then, you think it's a feint? I think they're trying to pull our fighters out of position. The real raid is coming behind this one. It was a guess. An intuition based on weeks of watching, learning, predicting. She had no proof. Just a feeling. Winters had to make the call. Scramble everything now and risk being wrong, or hold back and wait for confirmation. All sectors, hold fighters in reserve. Scramble only minimal intercept. Wait for secondary raid confirmation. Emily held her breath. If she was wrong, those bombers would get through unopposed. More deaths. More destruction. Her fault. 20 minutes later, radar stations along the coast lit up with new contacts. 50 aircraft. Coming in low and fast, using the first raid as cover. The real attack. Because Emily had seen the pattern, because she'd learned to read the invisible war, the fighters were in position. The intercept was perfect. The second raid was shattered before it reached the coast. That evening, Winters called her into the office. Emily went expecting something. Congratulations? Debriefing? Instead, Winters just looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You saved hundreds of lives today. Maybe thousands. I want you to know that." Emily nodded, too tired to feel anything. "I also want you to know that you can't keep doing this forever. No one can. When you need to stop, tell me. No shame in it. I'm not ready to stop." "Good, because we need you." Winters pulled out a file, stamped with red classification markings. "The invasion is coming. Maybe weeks, maybe months. When it does, this station will be coordinating the entire defensive operation. You'll be part of that. Front line, even though you're miles from the beach." Emily took the file, its weight somehow more than mere paper. "One more thing," Winters said. "Your garden shed. The one in Suffolk." Emily's breath caught. "What about it?" "It's still standing. Luftwaffe has bombed it twice more, destroyed everything around it. But the shed survived. RAF engineering went back to look. They found your father's old equipment, somehow still intact. They salvaged what they could." She pulled a small wooden box from her desk. Inside, Emily saw vacuum tubes, wire cutters, a crystal radio set, pieces of her father's dream, scarred but unbroken. "Thought you'd want these," Winters said quietly. Emily picked up the crystal set, felt its familiar weight. Her father had built this when she was 6 years old, had shown her how invisible waves could become sound, how the void could speak. Now those waves tracked death, guided killers, measured the distance to annihilation. But they also saved lives, protected the innocent, gave defenders a fighting chance. The same technology, different purposes, like everything in war. "Thank you," Emily whispered. That night, alone in her bunk, she held the crystal set and listened to its silence. No voices came through, no distant music, just the quiet. But in that quiet, she heard her father's voice anyway. Not magical, not mystical, just memory. "The invisible world is all around us, Emmy. Learn to see it, and you'll never be lost." She'd learned to see. Had learned too well, perhaps. Could see death approaching from 60 miles away. Could track it with mathematical precision. Could predict which young men would die and which would live. The price of seeing was knowing. The burden of knowing was carrying it. And she would carry it. Link in the chain, holding the line. Until the chain broke or the war ended. Whichever came first. Outside, in the darkness above the bunker, the stars were invisible behind clouds. But Emily knew they were there. The radar couldn't see them. Radio waves bounced off solid objects, not distant suns. Some things remained invisible even to those who'd learned to see. Maybe that was mercy. Maybe that was all that kept them human. The crystal set sat silent in her hands, a ghost of gentler days. And Emily Hartwell closed her eyes against tomorrow's coming light. The end.